If you will give it a home and promise no one will ever take it apart, I will build a carousel for Missoula. That was the promise Missoula cabinetmaker Chuck Cappridge made to the Missoula City Council in 1991. As a child, Cappridge had spent many happy hours on the carousel at Columbia Gardens in Butte, Montana. The Columbia Gardens carousel burned to the ground while Chuck was still a child. But his interest in carousels was rekindled by a visit to the Louvre Carousel in Spokane. While his wife Beth rode the carousel, Cappridge read the information displayed on the walls about the history of carousels in the United States. What he read convinced him carousel animals were truly works of art. So he decided he wanted one for his living room. His search for his own carousel horse was the journey that started a dream he soon shared with an entire community.
This man, I don't know if you can see him behind me, is named Fred Freed. And he's one of the reasons this carousel is here. He had written a history of carousels, and Chuck Cappridge, the guy that started this thing, had given Fred a call because he wanted to get an antique horse to give to his wife. He found out Fred was alive and living in New York, so he called him up and told him who he was. He says, "I'm Chuck from Missoula, Montana, and I'd like to give my wife a horse." This gentle-looking man told him, you know, just like all the other vultures, that he's the reason why there aren't very many carousels left in the U.S. He says at one time there were 5,000 hand-carved wooden carousels in the United States. And at this time, it must have been 88 or 87 when Chuck called him, he said there are less than 150 hand-carved carousels. He said if you really cared about a carousel, you'd carve your own damn horse, or better yet, build a carousel. And he hung up the phone. Well, Chuck got up a few days later or whatever, and his wife asked him what he wanted for his birthday. He says, well, I guess carving tools. And he had never carved before. So then he carved a horse. Then he carved another horse. He ended up carving 4 horses, and that's what started it. So I started with the carousel because of a phone call from Chuck Cappridge, and I think it was about 1989. He called and asked if I could draw a horse. I said, yes, I can draw a horse. And so I drew a horse, and he called me up a few days later and he says, that's perfect. And I said, for what? And he said, well, I'm going to build a carousel.
Chuck was kind of the dreamer here. He had these shelves, and the shelves, I can remember walking in, and the shelves were just lined with legs, and there would be a head, and here's a neck, and then these big bodies on all of his work tables. And every place that you looked in his shop had a piece of a horse, because they're all just made in, you know, pieces.
Well, first time that I saw Chuck's creation or knew something strange in town was going on is I followed him down Broadway one time with this big wooden carousel horse on the back of his little truck. A month or two later, I found in a newspaper article, they were talking about Chuck's presentation of this dream he had of a carousel. That they were starting to look for people who wanted to adopt a horse. I talked to my wife, Irene, and we, at that time, we were just really getting going in our career, didn't have a lot of money, made no sense on a financial level, but I said, I want to adopt a horse. I want to be part of this project. I called him, I went down to his shop, and we sat and started talking. Told him I wanted to adopt a horse, and I told him that I don't have to paint it, I don't have to create it, I just want to be part of this project.
The carving process, by the way, is pretty straightforward. First step, of course, is design. That then has to be translated into a full-size mock-up enlarged on full-size paper. Processing starts now in my shop. The whole thing is laminated out of 2-inch boards called basswood. Goes to my shop where it gets planed, and then we start laying out the patterns. They're typically carved in 7 pieces. A body, a head, sometimes the head and the neck are separate, 4 legs, tail. All those pieces are glued up, cut out roughly on a bandsaw, and then carved individually. Pieces then are blended together. There are no metal fasteners in any of these animals. That's kind of one of the unwritten rules. We make them hollow for 2 purposes. One, to save weight, one, to save material. The original carousel was all carved by hand. That was one of Chuck's real tenets, was that this was to be a hand-carved carousel, no machine carving on it. They're shaped out on a bandsaw to get the profile, but then it was all done by hand. Whoever does the body is the one that puts it all together, which sometimes is about as much work as carving the individual pieces, but oftentimes it doesn't look right when we actually start sticking them together. So one person has to be in charge of that part, is just sticking all the pieces together and making them all fit.
And I did some very basic line drawings of the horse. Chuck liked them. I say, I'm not going to put a saddle on it. I'm not going to put bridles on it. This is going to be a free-spirited horse. So even at the end of the drawing stage, I said, now Chuck, you can have somebody take this over and paint it, and it's okay, I understand. And he said, oh, no, you're not getting off that easy. You're going to paint this thing too.
If you're there for the gluing up procedure, you get to write your name and the date or whatever you might like. So all these horses that we have and all the ones that are going out, the other animals, all have little time capsules, you might say, inside, which is a neat thing. And all of them do that.
I think carving is a natural thing that I learned from watching Chuck Caprich and all of the other lead carvers. Is there's a strong intention to tell a story with their carving. It isn't just a lifeless thing as a result of that. Each thing that they do seems to tell a story, and I enjoyed learning that from the other carvers and tried to incorporate that.
Start to finish, we figure the horses take between 500 and 800 hours designing to painting. That's on average.
This is the outside of the horse. This side that's visible to the public as the carousel goes around is called the romance side, and it has much more detail on it than the other side, which is called the finance side or the money side.
My wife and I first got involved with the carousel, not at the beginning, but actually the next summer at a out to lunch, where I remember Jim Evans was carving, I think, on Schleppner. We thought, oh, great, what a wonderful thing to work on a carousel. But we also wanted to adopt a horse. And the last horse that was available that we could design, because the others that weren't adopted yet were ones that Chuck had carved, was Pal's Pal. And we adopted it for my wife's family. Her father was a florist, and he always had a parrot in their business. The parrot was always named Pal, and there were a whole number of them. So we designed our horse with lots of roses and ribbons and bows and a parrot. My grandchildren lived in Spokane, and they had some frogs, and we thought it would be a great idea to kind of mimic the idea that the imprint of a horse's hoof was called a frog, and so we put a frog on Pal's left foot. I think the final really great thing was that I got to carve the legs and the body of Pal's Pal. I really enjoyed our time carving.
All of the ponies on our carousel were adopted by someone. One of the greatest stories is about 4 of the ponies that we call the penny ponies. We had 2 5th grade teachers come to us and say, we really think the kids should be involved in this program. How can we get them involved? So we came up with the idea of putting milk jugs in the classrooms and collecting pennies. And we were hoping that those kids would be able to collect enough pennies to adopt 1 horse, so 250,000 pennies. Well, when the Missoula Federal Credit Union counted those pennies for us, the kids had collected 1 million pennies. A million pennies weighs 6,000 pounds. It fits into a cubic yard. So the 4 classes that raised the most money got to design those horses, but they belong to Missoula area school children, present and past.
Well, Snapples always has been one of my favorite horses from the beginning, just from even when he was a drawing before he ever came into wood or was, you know, in pieces. One of the biggest reasons is that he's one of 4 penny ponies. The kids that had the privilege of designing him loved their teacher so much. Her initials were SN, and her favorite thing was apples. And so they used her initials SN and apples, and that's how he got his name, as Snapples.
I remember when we first opened the carousel, they collected all these pennies, and I felt like I was doing something for children. And I'd like to say that I hope that those children are now growing up and they have children of their own, and that they will continue to work on the carousel and keep it running forever.
Missoula Rotary Club sponsored the horse, and it came to one of the meetings and they wanted to name the horse. Well, they kicked around a lot of different names, you know, Rosebud and Shining Rose and all these kind of things, and I just lost my horse, and his name was Cannonball. He was one of the horses that I'd ridden for about 28 years in the Bob Marshall, leading pack strings and taking guests from all over the country into the Bob Marshall. I popped up and I said, let's name him Cannonball. And the committee thought it over a minute or two, and they said, yep, Cannonball's a good name. Cannonball was about 32 years old when he died of old age. And like I said, I rode him all over the Bob Marshall. He's well over 100,000 miles, I'm sure.
Fred was pretty cool, and after we worked on it for a couple of years and had horses and everything, I kept after Chuck and find out if he had written Fred a letter to tell him what he'd started. About the 4th time I asked him, he said, well, if you think it's important, why don't you just write him a letter? I said, okay. So I wrote him a letter and sent him some pictures, and Fred was just excited. And he sent us a care package which included 2 big jewels, which we put on our lead horse, Columbia Belle, and they're from the first carousel that had the Mangles mechanism on it that made the horses go up and down and around and around.
If it hadn't have been for Chuck Caprich, there wouldn't have been a carousel here, because he made the statement there was going to be one if he had to take the rest of his life making one. And it just happened that lots of things that needed to be done, I was able to do. I was trained in it. I had the time when a lot of the other guys were working. I spent a lot of hours out at the machine shop, which saved the carousel a lot of money. That's how I got into it. We had lots of fun putting it together.
We worked for 5 years restoring the machine. When we hauled it into town, it was just a pile of scrap iron. Even the big rods up on top were twisted up into bows, so they're easier to haul, so all that had to be straightened out. But the mechanical crew met every Monday night for about 5 years. So every single part had to be sandblasted and cleaned and straightened. Like I say, the big stave rods up on top are 20-some foot long, and they're 3/4 inch steel rods. They'd actually bend them over and tie them in a knot, so they were less than 8 foot long, so they could haul them in the back of a pickup. Well, all of those had to be bent back to straight, which was hours and hours and hours with a metal press to straighten all the rods out. There again, we could have simply, it'd been a lot easier just to go down and buy all brand new ones. But we wanted the 1916 Herschel Spillman, and that's exactly what sits here today, due to my mechanical crew. 16,066 parts had to be restored. And that doesn't count the nuts and bolts and screws and the bad words. Yeah, there was a couple of those said. But the whole deal is there's so much craftsmanship in everything that's done in here. The carvers, the painters, the mechanical crew, everything is done right. Mac, our genius mechanic at 90 or wherever, is right in there. sometimes he would get busy doing his own little thing and us other mechanics would be working on something. And we kind of need some help from Mac, but he was busy doing something. So all we had to do was say to each other is, oh, it's close enough. And boy, Mac's ears would pop it up and he'd come zipping over. If it isn't right, it isn't close enough. People told us when we first started this project, well, you know, there's a lot better bearings out there nowadays than what we had in the old days. These are Babbitt bearings, and you can see where they're poured using Babbitt, which is basically a tin alloy. We pour these ourselves. Here again, Mac taught us the art of pouring Babbitt bearings. We re-pour these bearings. This particular bearing is what you call a tower bearing. There's 12 of them up on top, and we re-pour these probably every couple of years, and then machine them back down so they fit the shafts. They actually run on the back side of the gears. This is one of the old ones, which is obviously wore out. These do require being greased, but it gives us a chance to get up and inspect, lawyer-proof the machines as best we can to make sure there's no problems coming up, so we try to stay ahead of it. But there again, that's my mechanical crew. That all I am is a parts chaser for my crew, because I've got the best crew in the world.
Right after we got it up and got running, I told Chuck, I says, let's tear it down and see how soon we can get it put back up again, because they used to tear it down and move overnight and have it up again the next day. But I don't think we would have got it done.
You know, the very first time I heard the band organ, the building was under construction and it was a mess. And I got a call from Chuck Caprich that said, you should come down and hear the band organ. And I came down, and I knew the power started up and the mechanism started to play, and you could hear it a little bit. And all of a sudden came this most beautiful sound of the song Tuppence from Mary Poppins. And I just got goosebumps. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. And I couldn't believe how beautiful it was. We'd paid like $70,000 for this band organ, and it was worth it.
The organ was a major, major thing. And among the donations towards the organ was one in honor of my very elderly aunt, who was like the fairy godmother to our family. My family had a part both in paying for Avalon and helping to build the organ. When I think about the carousel, I think about it being like the cherry on top of the ice cream sundae that was Caras Park. And Caras Park, thanks to MRA, the redevelopment agency, thought the river could be something good in town rather than what it had been, which was a dumping ground for old autos, all kinds of trash. It was amazing.
At the redevelopment agency, I got lots of proposals for projects from people, but I'd never had one that was this outrageous. His proposal to build a carousel for Missoula was something that I viewed, quite honestly, with a great deal of skepticism. But Chuck was shrewd. He brought along the first 4 horses that he carved. And so at the beginning, my skepticism and head shaking when I saw the ponies turned into head nodding. And I began to understand his vision. I understood how important it was to do this for Missoula, and I understood how absolutely committed Chuck was to making this happen. I realized that this was a project that I had to personally help happen whatever way I could. The first thing that I had to be able to do was to convince the redevelopment agency board that the board needed to get behind this project too. And so we put it on the agenda, and again, Chuck brought along his 4 best ambassadors, the 4 ponies that he'd already carved, and he made the pitch to the MRA board, and just like me, the board went from skepticism to nodding heads. And they said, yes, we will do whatever we can to help make this project happen. We took the horses to the Parks Board and we asked them for a piece of ground that was 100 feet by 100 feet in area. And like everyone, the Parks Board and the city agreed that this was the place for the carousel.
So the park became the center of town. And when the idea of the carousel was first suggested, I just thought, how great. You know, we tried to make Out to Lunch very family oriented, but here's something really specific for kids to do. When Chuck brought the 4 ponies that he had already carved to Out to Lunch one day, the enthusiasm and excitement about the possibility was just unbelievable. And people just leapt for joy.
The next step after securing the location was getting a design. We retained the services of the head of the School of Architecture at Montana State University to sponsor American Institute of Architecture sanctioned design competition. We had, I believe, a dozen or so proposals for designs submitted. We had a jury that selected the design for our carousel building, which was submitted by a local architect whose name is J. Kirby. Building a building, getting the design, getting it built so it will stand up, so it will be perfect and weatherized and pass building inspections. That's a challenge, and it's not cheap. The building itself, after all said and done, I think cost in excess of $400,000. It was that part of the carousel project that was probably the most challenging for us, finding the money to build the building, because that was the big tough part to sell. And we adopted an approach for the building that was similar to the approach for building the carousel itself, and that was adopting out elements of the structure that people could say, our family adopted this or our business adopted that. That spirit allowed everyone in the community to participate in building this. And when I tell people the story of the carousel, I always mention that this was the gift that Missoula gave to itself.
A ceremonial groundbreaking for the Carousel building was held on April 14, 1994. Following the groundbreaking, 400 people attended an auction held to raise money to help pay for the Carousel building. Many items sold at the auction were handcrafted by the people who were working so hard to complete the carousel itself. Among the most coveted items at the auction were 3 replacement ponies, which would ride the carousel when other ponies were removed for repairs, would make guest appearances throughout Missoula, or in the case of Santa's pony, would add to the celebration of a season. The Carousel Board had hoped to realize $30,000 from sales at the auction, but the sales of the 3 replacement ponies alone brought in that amount. Ultimately, the auction proved to be the most successful one in Missoula's history up to that time, bringing in $80,000 to help raise the barn.
I was asked to be on the board by Jeff Badnock, who was the MRA director at the time, because of my background in construction and architecture. And at that time, it was apparent that this carousel project was really going to become a real thing. And so the need for a building was paramount. When you had men and women who were painting and carving with Chuck and donating tens of thousands of hours to donate this wonderful thing to Missoula, and then you had little kids shaking money out of their piggy banks to also pay for it, it was fairly easy to get the construction and the architectural community involved and behind this project. My job was relatively easy. We had people beating down the doors trying to figure out how they could donate building materials or labor or architectural services, building services to the project. So it became more of a coordination project than anything. And Structural Systems was the low construction company that built the project. But we did have a lot of materials that were donated. If I remember right, the 2 concrete companies in town donated all the material for the concrete, and Overhead Door, I think, donated all of the overhead doors on a national basis from their national headquarters. So we had a lot of materials that were donated to the project, and that really helped the bottom line of it.
You know, we needed to try to finance the building of this. We were raising money. It's always difficult to raise money, but our cash needs were running ahead of the fundraising, and 2 or 3 of the board members went and met with a group of bankers from Missoula, and we met in the First Interstate Bank conference room, and there was a fair bit of skepticism. We were asking them for a $100,000 credit line, and then Bill Boucher spoke, and Bill convinced everyone in that room, presidents of virtually every bank in Missoula, that they needed to stand behind this community project, and they did, and we had this $100,000 credit line which we could use. But the favorite letter I ever wrote as president of the board of directors was when I wrote to all of the bankers after we'd raised the money and we were open, and I was able to tell them that we didn't need the money, we had never drawn on the money, and they could terminate the line of credit.
By opening day, May 27, 1995, over 100,000 hours of volunteer time had gone into the construction of 38 permanent ponies, 3 replacement ponies, 2 chariots, 14 gargoyles, gargoyle frames and mirror frames, and the largest band organ in continuous use in the United States, all within a jewel box building. Community members donated time, services, materials, and encouragement. School children collected over 1 million pennies to adopt 4 ponies. Stained glass artists constructed shimmering windows. Mechanics poured Babbitt. Majestic horses' heads emerged from blocks of wood, and people found lasting friendships among the wood chips. The community extended as far as Calgary, Alberta, Canada, where the Midnight Rose carvers built a friendship horse for Missoula. The story of the carousel includes wood and metal, concrete and colored glass, hearts and hands, and countless hours of loving labor.
I deal with a lot of people who come to me and want to start painting again in their life, and they were told early in their life that they're not very creative, that they couldn't draw a tree or a horse or whatever it was, and so by the time they were 6 or 7, they just quit creating. I was with Chuck, and we were kind of leaning up against one of the doorways there in the mall, and you know, he said something basically. He said, it's a good thing these people were never told that they couldn't do a carousel. They couldn't paint, they couldn't sculpt, but you know what? No one ever told them they couldn't do a carousel.
There was this sort of disbelief that people had towards us, but I think that we all really believed that it would happen, and it just started building momentum until it wasn't a question that it was going to come to be.
People who participated in building the carousel know that they were part of something larger than themselves, but they also knew at the same time that their contribution was meaningful. And at the end, when we opened the doors on that wonderful May day, and the crowds of people waiting to take their first ride on the carousel extended all the way from the carousel building through the park and on and on and on, that was the community's celebration of the gift that it had given itself.
You know, opening day was a great day. We planned a parade, and we didn't know how many people would show up. We had an event over by the tent, and then we were going to do a big opening day with free rides. And the parade route was filled with people. And we got down here, and I was fortunate enough to be able to be master of ceremonies. And I introduced all the people on the stage, the board members and some of the people who were on stage, including Senator Baucus. And I said, gee, it seems like I'm forgetting somebody. Of course, I hadn't introduced Chuck Caprich yet. And somebody out in this big audience yelled, Chuck. And I said, that's right, Chuck Caprich. And everybody stood up. The crowd estimates were 12,000 people, and everybody stood up and applauded. And that was a magical moment.
The carousel's grand opening attracted the attention of the national press. World News Tonight reported the eminent event the night before the grand opening, and Good Morning America started the big day with a report on the celebration. National Public Radio also helped spread the word about the Carousel's opening and its place in history. These stories, plus exposure in Reader's Digest, Sunset, People, Highlights for Children, and other publications, attracted visitors from around the country for years to come.
About a week after we opened the Carousel, there was a letter to the editor in the paper from a man who had a daughter who had multiple disabilities. He talked about how when Eleonora got on the Carousel, she could feel what was going on. She could sense the sound through her body, even though she couldn't actually hear it. And he said that the only time that she felt like all of the other kids was when she was on the Carousel. And to me, that's a very telling thing about our Carousel. So people with any kind of disability are always welcome to ride for free on our Carousel, and they bless us by their presence.
One of the real joys that I've had is bringing my grandchildren down here to watch them play on these horses and run for paint. While I was doing that one Saturday afternoon, I had this woman come up to me with a little girl next to her, and she asked my name, if I was Mr. Purney. I said yes, and she said, "Well, I just want to thank you for doing paint." And I said, "Well, thank you. I'm kind of proud of it. I like it too, and obviously my grandkids do, and it means a lot to me too. Thank you for telling me." And I said, "Is there some story you want to tell me?" And she said, "Well, yes." She said, "My daughter is almost blind, and the only horse that she could really see is paint." And so those kinds of things happen all the time with paint.
The last time I was here, which was just a couple of weeks ago, I was not only watching the children, I was watching all of the adults. Some of them were on the horses, but a lot of them were like me, sitting watching either their children or their grandchildren, and everybody had smiles on their faces. So it's just such a great part of our community, and it's something we really need to preserve. I think it's going to be very important that we do whatever is necessary to make it always a viable operation. A really important thing that it symbolizes is the spirit that I think prevails in Missoula. I've talked to many people around the state, and Missoula is well known for this spirit of pitching in and getting things done.
A Carousel for Missoula is part of the larger story of carousels in the United States, a story that dates back to the late 1800s and early 1900s. The golden age of carousels in America. During those years, immigrants worked in factories to turn out carousels for companies that placed them in communities throughout the country. Missoula's Carousel owes special thanks to the Loof Riverfront Carousel in Spokane, Washington, which sparked Chuck's desire for a personal carousel horse, and especially to Betty Largent and her husband Don. Betty is nationally known as an excellent painter of carousel figures and is also president of the National Carousel Association.
The National Carousel Association was founded in 1973, and their mission statement is basically to make the public aware of the legacy of carousels, educate them, and to save antique carousels. And when communities like Missoula came along and they didn't want to buy up a carousel that had history in a community, they chose to create one. It was a beginning of a segment of history for the entire carousels in the United States. No one had picked up the craft until this period of time. It began to tell a story of its own. They didn't try to recreate the carving style of, say, a Charles Loof or a William Denzel or a C.W. Parker. They brought out figures that were fun and comical, and I refer to them as Missoula style. They began a new generation of carousels, and from there, these have spawned carousels throughout the United States. He would go on and help Salem, Oregon, and Salem would go on and help Albany. Missoula showed the carousel industry and the carousel world and Americans that we can create works of art and they can replicate exactly how a carousel operated, but they tell a new story about the industry. The change in Missoula has been significant. Since my first trip to see Chuck's workshop in his garage, he began teaching classes from what he had learned. He asked me to teach classes from what I had learned working on the Spokane Loop. And as they say, the rest has become history, and it's become a legacy for Missoula. Today is tomorrow's history.
Missoula's Carousel has been inspired by, as well as the inspiration for, many other groups and projects throughout Missoula. A group of artists and authors wrote Pony Tales, a whimsical book about the carousel and its ponies as a fundraiser for the carousel. The Missoulian, the community's local newspaper, wrote a book detailing the carousel's history. In April of 1995, the MCT Center for the Performing Arts produced the show Carousel as a tribute to the volunteers working to complete the carousel. Ride a Painted Pony was the theme of the 1995 University of Montana Homecoming Parade and celebration. Flying Fireworks, an original ballet, choreographed by Charlene Campbell and featuring music by Albert Potts III, was performed on the stage of the historic Wilma Theater by the Rocky Mountain Ballet Theater Company. Included were dances inspired by specific carousel ponies and a walk-on part by carousel volunteers Jerry and Ethel Dietert. Further afield, Cosmopolitan magazine even touted a carousel for Missoula as one of the most romantic places in the country, because you can kiss your sweetheart on a hand-carved carousel next to the Clark Fork River. A Carousel for Missoula was one part of The American Promise, a PBS documentary produced by the Farmers Insurance Group of companies to celebrate democracy and show how volunteers and entrepreneurs exemplify what is best about our country. The Carousel is consistently voted best place to take out-of-town visitors or best tourist attraction in local newspaper polls, and it remains a favorite with residents and visitors alike. In the spring of 2001, over 4,000 volunteers gathered to create Dragon Hollow play area next to the carousel in just 9 days. A grassy field became a magical playland, again with the help of the entire community and friends from around the world.
Even before we finished the carousel, we started thinking that it'd be really fun if we had more for kids to do down here. So all along we were thinking about maybe someday we'd have a play area next to the carousel. Well, eventually we stumbled upon a playground architectural firm named Leathers and Associates from Ithaca, New York, that does community-built playgrounds around the country. So we invited them to come to Missoula. They did a design day with kids in different classrooms, coming up with these fabulous ideas for a play area. And then 9 months later they came back and we started building Dragon Hollow.
We had to start doing all our planning and so forth. We needed to get all of the equipment, like drills and saws and whatever. We needed to get all of the materials. We needed to find out from the kids what kind of a play area they would like, and we needed to get volunteers. We did go around to schools and ask the third graders and some of the other grades what kind of a play area they would like. And a little girl out at Hellgate Elementary said she wanted a spit bucket. I mean, a spit bucket? She says, yes, everybody can spit in the bucket, and when we get enough, we'll put it on the slide and make it real slick. I can remember when the first 2 days, we had to drill holes for, I think, about 125 posts that were 12 feet long, 6-8 inches in diameter, and it took 3 or 4 people to carry one of those to the holes. Well, when they were drilling the holes, we hit a water line and a power line and a gas line and a phone line. We were 100%. After those 2 days, then we had a 7-day build, I believe it was. People would show up and need to be guided to their work, and that was kind of my job. So I used to put on this hat every morning so people could find me so they could be sent to their job, whether it was sawing or drilling or assembling, or kids were making mosaics and decorations on bricks, and it was just a wonderful thing.
It's got 3 big dragons with big slides associated with them. It's just a fabulous, magical play area. It was built by 4,000 volunteers in 9 days. So if you were assigned to a task and you sat down and you started working on your task and you looked up, all of the people around you had changed and all of the landscape around you had changed because things happened just that quickly.
And believe it or not, we got it finished about 5 o'clock in the afternoon of that 7th day. The people from Leather said, "It's open," and the kids swarmed in. It was just wonderful. And they still come in swarms.
The spirit of giving which created the carousel didn't end when the building opened. Volunteers carve ponies for other carousels and local not-for-profit organizations, and restore ponies for antique carousels. The mechanical crew donates time to keep the machine in top condition, and many others help improve and maintain the carousel as a gift to the community. Missoula's carousel is open year-round, closing for only 10 days in January when annual maintenance is performed on the machine, the ponies are painted, and the building is thoroughly cleaned. Everyone is invited to ride for free on the Saturday of Memorial Day weekend to celebrate the carousel's birthday, and on Thanksgiving, Christmas, and during First Night, Missoula's alcohol-free New Year's Eve celebration.
We've kept a group of carvers and painters together, and we call ourselves the Pony Keepers. And since we opened this carousel, we have decided that any city or town or whatever that is going to build a carousel and wants help, if we hear about them, we offer to carve them an animal as a gift from our carousel to theirs.
One of the things on the carousel that may not be realized is that one of those horses was not carved by the volunteers here. It in fact came from Calgary, Alberta. A group of carvers up there volunteered to carve us a horse, and which they did and delivered to us. So we all thought we could do that. To date, I just counted through the thing, we've done 30-some such projects since the carousel opened. Not all for carousels. Quite a number of them have been projects that were intended as fundraisers, money things for other nonprofits. For example, we carved a big rocking pony, full-size pony on rockers, if you can imagine that. It was auctioned off to raise money for the pavilion next door. Made a little horse for hospice to auction off. We've also made ponies for Habitat for Humanity, for Fort Missoula Historical Society, plus all the ones that have gone to the carousels. All those, I mentioned, they're not all ponies. We carved, one of my favorites is a snapping turtle that's gone to a new carousel in Adirondack Mountains of New York. A couple of unusual ones went to a carousel in Tacoma. John Thompson by himself carved an armored slug, and then the rest of us carved a walrus for them.
I came in when there was a sea turtle, so I helped a little bit with the finishing of the sea turtle. There are always projects that are going on. Some are in a semi-finished stage and some are in a beginning stage, so you can fit in wherever you want and whatever you want to do. You don't get a lot of immediate instructions. You are working with a group of people, and somebody might say, you know, it'd be a lot easier if you used your tool like this, or that leg's a little fat and blocky. Come out here and look at the horse's leg and we'll see how to make it less blocky. This is one of our newest projects. It's a bison, and it will go to Albany, Oregon.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure for both of us to work with the people here. They're all really good people, and they'll help you out as much as they can. And with me being a mechanic, I've been learning for 5 years, and I still feel like I'm an apprentice out there.
And my part is to organize teams of people to come in and repair damage that occurs during the year. We usually have around 25 people who come in and look the animals over, clean them if they need more cleaning. They sand the damaged parts, and then they match the paints and they paint the damaged parts. because we want the carousel to keep looking fresh and new. But the dragon is John Thompson's baby. John loves dragons. He carved all the dragons that you see around here. I don't know exactly how the dragon idea was born, but John Thompson carved him. We painted him. But he just loves dragons in general.
I think there are dragons someplace. And I would love to ride one. In fact, we now have one on the carousel that I carved that the kids can ride. You know, and at one time they had gargoyles and things that would guard the jewels and stuff of the royalty that would ride carousels and things like that. So when Chuck had me design the band organ, I had free reign with it. He just said have fun with it. So we did dragons and castles and men in arms and things like that. And the dragon motif just kind of continued, and nobody really complained too much about it, so we just kept on. I would think almost any kid would want to ride a dragon. So they're just kind of fun critters.
I enjoy bringing the children forward, and I invite them while I'm working on a project I hand them the carving tool, guide their hand carefully so that they don't injure themselves, and have them draw just any amount of material off of whatever it is that I'm carving. And then what I do is I anoint them by taking the shavings, putting them on the shoulder, and announcing that they are now a carousel junkie. And then I reward them with a carousel token. And I remind them then that forevermore they must go forward in the protection and preservation and appreciation of carousels. Wherever they go, for the rest of their lives, they'll be part of this project.
While the carousel project was underway, there was a woman from Salem, Oregon, who came to Missoula quite often. This woman was a mover and shaker in her own community. And as she watched the carousel project grow and unfold, she said to herself, if they can do this project in Missoula, Montana, we can do it in Salem, Oregon. Hazel had made some contacts with the people here at the carousel and other people on the foundation. I took a couple of trips to Salem and sat down with the organizers in the community who wanted to build a carousel, and we told them all the things that we had done and how we had done it and what things we would do differently. They followed our model, and the Salem Carousel today functions just for them the same way ours does. It's a focal point for the community to celebrate itself, an attraction to take visitors to, and it's a reminder to the people of Salem, just as this carousel is a reminder to the people of Missoula, when we want to do something and we commit ourselves with passion and cooperation, we can do anything, including build a carousel that none of us knew how to build.
If magic can happen anywhere, it will happen in Missoula, where dreams are followed and promises are kept, and where people believe in making a life as well as making a living.
As much as I love all of the ponies on this carousel, I really have always thought the story of the carousel is the story of the people who built the carousel, the people who come to the carousel, the people who support the carousel in so many different ways. It's about people working together to build something that is greater than themselves. It's about people working together to enhance the community they live in. It's just about the people giving back to the community and doing what they think is right to build something that's wonderful for all of us.
I guess it has to be with all the friendships. And I mean, I walk around the carousel and I look at it, and I can look at the different horses, and I can pretty much visualize almost on every horse who did what, you know, who carved it, who painted it. And I think about the friendships and the folks that aren't with us anymore. And there was one gentleman by the name of Jim Evans who every Tuesday night he made cookies, and he became the cookie man, and he would make cookies Tuesday nights, and then he would serve leftover cookies the rest of the week because he carved almost every day. He did just some amazing things. And there's Scott Olson, who was our Gavi man, who took care of the band organ. There's the mechanics, who are just amazing because anybody can learn to carve, but to make this machinery that's 1918, you know, over 100 years old, go up and down, around and around, and make it go smoothly is just amazing. So
I've been with this project for the better part of 20 years, And I'm standing by my first love with the carousel. This is the first horse that I had the opportunity to work with. And because of a medical disability that was present, an injured arm, when I first started working on this horse, I became Jim the One-Armed Carver for a short time. I did a great deal of work on the body of this horse. As a result of that, and the legs, I was able to restore function, and so both the horse and I got better together. You'll see that there are two lions' heads on the side of this horse. Amongst the mane of these two little lions, I have all of my grandchildren's initials carved. This project is a most magical thing to me because it represents a community coming together to do something that brought laughter and seemed therefore so worthwhile. I have this grand love affair with this project because it's a way of those who are moving on can leave a gift to the future. And the next point that I try to emphasize is for all of the people that visit our carousel here, I remind them that it isn't owned by a corporation or a city or a group of people or the Carousel Foundation. It's owned by them.
Right after we opened the carousel, I came down here every day. There was a little girl, and she knew that I worked on the carousel, and she picked a flower along the river, and she brought it to me. She was so happy that I helped make this carousel so she could ride it, that she picked this little flower, brought it to me. So it has a lot of little stories like that.
Another thing that really touched me was the thoughtfulness that knew that not everybody in town could climb up on a pony. And so we have, what, 2 chariots, I believe it is, where maybe a mother with a baby, maybe no person like me, can sit comfortably. And while it doesn't bob up and down like the ponies do, you still get part of the thrill of riding on a carousel, being a part of it. Still one of the best things that happened to Missoula.
We've talked before about the transition of bringing them when they're about 2, having them on a horse, clutching them tightly and them clutching the horse tightly. And then pretty soon you're on the horse and they're on the horse, but you're both easing up your grip a little bit. Pretty soon you're on the horse and they're on the horse, but they really wish you weren't on the horse. And then pretty soon you move to the horse next to their horse and they want you there. And then pretty soon they don't want you there and we're all gathered around the edge of the carousel watching. I've gone through that transition with all of our grandchildren. And it's because of those endless number of hours of joy over the last literally 15 years that I feel so very strongly about the carousel.
It's definitely the fair of the heart for me.
From the moment the carousel opened, it has always been important to us, to the administration of the carousel, to the board of the carousel, to all the volunteers, that we give back to this community, because this community was so generous when we built the carousel, and they're still generous to the carousel today, making sure that we can continue to operate year-round, making sure that the carousel and Dragon Hollow stay safe and clean. So we do all we can to give back to this wonderful community that gave this carousel to itself.
Yeah, the community support has been 100% all the way. Hasn't faded in the 20 years I've been involved with this thing. The community has never left us behind.
Our 2 children, Philip and Olivia, were probably 6 and 8 at the time, maybe even younger than that, maybe 5 and 7. Of course, they were enthralled, like all children in Missoula were, with the project. They were enamored by it and wanted to be a part of it. And I think that whether you were 8 years old or 80 years old, this project brought up the child in all of us, and it aroused that childhood dream that we all have through life. And so we could see the excitement through our children's eyes, and I think many grandparents could see that in, you know, their grandkids or parents with their kids. And so again, it was a very contagious energy that went through the whole community. It was by far the easiest public project, I think, that anyone could be involved with.
People forget that, you know, what are we being paid? We're being honored by people paying attention to what we do. We're being paid in hugs and cookies and smiles and gratitude.
When I come in and I see all those kids riding and they're always smiling, and it just brings tears to my eyes. So it's so wonderful to have had a part in building these treasures for Missoula. One day, kind of a scrap of blue paper came with big block letters from a little boy that was 4 years old, and it said, "Here's my $1 for the ponies." That just gets me every time.